All right, we're going through some of the genre of Scripture in our series on how to read the Bible as literature. And so we're entering into the section on biblical narrative. Remember, if you want to learn more and to go into more detail, anything that Leland Ryken writes about treating the Bible as literature is a good thing. And he has a whole volume on biblical narrative. So we'll take some of the ideas from there. All right, let's talk a little bit about what we have before us when we talk about biblical narrative. When we talk about biblical narrative, we're talking about both the form that it takes and what's in the story, the content. And so we want to pay attention to both of those aspects. As we look at the narrative, the stories will embody familiar human experience. David will act like David when he is good, and David will act like human beings and David when he is bad. And we recognize those characters because we recognize those impulses in ourselves. So the stories embody familiar human experience, and they help us perhaps see our own lives with some heightened clarity. Bible stories help us also to build bridges between the ancient world and our own world. We have sort of a presentism about us, which we judge the past and we think they're so primitive. But once we go back there and start looking around, we see, those human beings are a lot like us. And so we build bridges between that ancient world and our own world. And then when we read these stories, they take us out of our present and drop us in that world, and then when we come back, we bring the things we've learned there back into our own world. So appreciate Leland Ryken's advice there concerning narrative. What we want to ask the text when we read it is, what is the author's intent in selecting the stories that he does? So sometimes he will tell stories and you're wondering, why did he tell that? And then sometimes we're looking for, wish we had that story, but we don't get that story. So it's important to recognize why he includes the stories that he does and why he leaves out perhaps some of the stories we wish he had put in. We want to look for clues to what he wants to tell us about his world and what he wants to tell us about our own world. So in this case, we are taking into account both the human author and the divine author, because all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable to us for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness. And that's exactly some of the easiest stories to bring over into our own world, or easiest genres, is the biblical story. There are several elements of the narrative that we'll be discussing, some of them in turn. We'll talk about setting. Setting matters a lot. So if you can take a class on the geography of Israel, it will help you to understand some of the stories that are told. Characters, they'll look a lot like us, but sometimes their obedience or their disobedience, their actions are dictated by the times in which they live. So we'll pay attention to the characters that are in the story. We'll pay attention to the way that the plot is structured and what the sequence of events are that play into the story we're reading. Sometimes we'll look at the plot devices that are there. Sometimes we'll look at the stories like the Gospels as hero stories. The disciples are selecting out exactly those stories that help us to underscore our belief in him. And so that's what we have in the biblical stories that are the Gospels. So those are some of the elements of narrative. So let's, by way of application, let's try this. Choose your favorite Bible story and then ask yourself these 4 questions. So let's take something, a story that is common to all of us. Let's take the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel. Lots of interesting things happening there with the ways in which Baal worship is accomplished, the ways in which supernatural things happen, what the government of King and Queen Ahab and Jezebel have invested in false religion. all kinds of details that we could ask ourselves. But let's take that story and then later take your own story and ask these questions as well. Why does the author choose to tell us this story? Well, I think the prophet, the history writers are telling us that there is only one God, the true God, and he will make himself known. And the false gods are just one cut and slice and cry and fear and providing nothing. What details does he choose to include? If we take the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel, he talks in considerable detail about how the altar is constructed and what happens when fire falls on that altar. He chooses to use mocking and satire in the mouth of Elijah, which Elijah actually did, but he mocked the interpreters of Baal, and the author is sure to include that description of Elijah's mocking. You might check then what stories come before that story and what stories come after. So before we see God faithfully providing for Elijah by a brook, by the wing of a raven, taking care of him. And then after the story, we read Elijah run because rain does come, but he is afraid of the queen. And it's an interesting story right on the heels of the kind of exuberance that would come from God answering by fire on the altar at Mount Carmel. And then we could ask ourselves again, so what is the point that the author is trying to make? What is he trying to tell me? And that will be helpful in my application of the story in my own context and in my own experience. So that's the introduction to narrative. We're going to take some of these elements in particular, and that will come up in our next episode. Thanks for hanging out.